The snow didn't fall. It hung, a thin, wind-suspended powder that never quite committed to the ground, never quite lifted away, just drifted in sheets across the daylight like breath on cold glass. The sky was a hard, pale blue, the kind you only get at altitude, the kind that makes distance lie. A ridgeline looked close enough to touch, and then you tried to move to it and realized the mountain had been laughing at you. Down in the basin, the seal element had stopped being a unit and started being a set of separate problems. A man was on his side behind a rock shelf, one glove pressed to his thigh, crimson already darkening against white. Another was pinned on his back, knees tucked, rifle angled uselessly over a lip of stone that might as well have been cardboard. Two more crouched low, trying to make themselves smaller than they were, trying to fit their bodies into the geometry of survival. Above them, on the rim of the bowl, muzzle flashes blinked and vanished in the snow-bright daylight, tiny, precise pinpricks that belonged to people who understood angles. The first thing that died had been the radio, not with a dramatic pop or a shower of sparks, just a sudden flattening in a static, an ugly hiss that ate every attempt at speech. The comms specialist had slapped the side of his handset like you could coax a signal back with anger. He tried primary. He tried a backup frequency. He tried the satellite link. Nothing. The only response was that same steady roar, like a waterfall made of nails. He looked at the team lead and shook his head once. No voice. No lifeline. Their hand signals were clipped and sharp and old, the kind you didn't have to think about when your mouth couldn't help you. Point. Hold. Down. Wait. But even the signals felt thin out here, swallowed by distance and the glare off snow. Someone on the ridge shouted in English. The words came down clear as if the cold carried them. Americans, drop your weapons. Hands up. You live. Another voice, closer, laughed like it already knew the ending. The enemy had a loudspeaker too, tinny, amplified, too calm for a firefight. It made the demand sound like an instruction. Stand up, one at a time, hands on head. No tricks. The team lead, senior enlisted, the kind of man who could say everything with one look, kept his cheek against the rock and stared at the bowl's rim. He wasn't counting enemies. You couldn't count what you couldn't see. He was counting time. Every minute they stayed pinned meant another minute for the ring to tighten. Another minute for someone above to walk a mortar round closer. Another minute for the cold to work its way into the wounded man's blood loss. Another minute for magazines to get lighter. And magazines were already too light. They'd come in for a snatch and sweep on a ridgeline relay site. Fast, quiet, in and out. They weren't loaded for a stand-up fight in a kill box. The kill box was obvious now in the way the terrain mocked them. High ground on all sides, lines of fire crossing the bowl like invisible wires, dead space where their rounds did nothing but chip granite. The only way out was a chute that climbed steep through scrub and ice. And the chute was under a crew serve gun that spoke in heavy, impatient bursts whenever anyone even shifted their knee. A round hit the rock shelf a foot above the team lead's head, and the impact threw shards into his collar. He didn't flinch, not because he was fearless, because fear didn't have room. There was only function. The medic crawled to the bleeding man and pushed a tourniquet down with both hands, jaw clenched. The wounded man's eyes were too wide, his breath shallow and fast, pupils sucking in the bright world like it was disappearing. The comm specialist reached for a small backup beacon, thumbed it awake, and stared at the blinking light like it was a prayer. Red. Blink. Red. The battery icon crawled down to nothing, and the beacon died in his palm. He didn't swear. He just closed his fist around it, like if he didn't look at it, it might not be true. A shout from above, impatient now. Now. Stand up. The team lead raised his head just enough to look at his men. He saw what they all saw. They had one wounded and bleeding, one medic partially exposed, the rest pinned with dwindling ammo. No comms, no clean exit. Their planned extraction window, tight by design, was already bleeding away. Even if they could get a call out, the bird wouldn't hover under mortar and machine gun. He weighed the ugly truth. Surrender wasn't honor. Surrender was triage. He lifted his hand, palm out, the universal signal. Stand down. For a second, it looked like the cold itself took a breath. Shoulders sagged. Fingers loosened their grip on rifles. Men who were built to keep fighting felt the protocol settle over them like a blanket, heavy and humiliating and, maybe, necessary. The medic paused mid-motion. The comms specialist stared at the raised hand as if he hadn't understood the language. One of the assaulters swallowed hard and nodded once, eyes hard with something close to grief. They began to move the wounded man, just enough to prepare him to stand, to keep him from collapsing when the order came down. One at a time, hands up, slow. Up on the rim, the enemy's confidence rose with the first signs of compliance. Shouts turned to commands. Boots crunched in snow as someone repositioned to get a better view, to record, to enjoy. And then the world split along a different seam. High above, on a separate spine of rock where the wind scoured the snow down to hard crust, a woman lay so still she could have been part of the mountain. Daylight glared off the ridge, but her body was tucked into shadow, pressed into a shallow depression behind a slab of stone. Her cheek was cold against the stock. Her breath was slow and controlled, barely disturbing the frost at the edge of her scarf. Her rifle wasn't a brand name. It wasn't a symbol. It was a tool. Matte, stripped of shine, taped where it needed to be taped. The optic, though, that was compromised. A hairline crack ran through the glass like a pale vein. Not catastrophic, but enough to distort the edge of the bowl below, enough to make straight lines bend and turn distance into uncertainty. The kind of thing that made most people hesitate. She didn't hesitate. She watched the surrender forming below and didn't let her chest tighten around it. She didn't let anger make her sloppy. She let the math take over. Jammer. Command node. Force multipliers. Her eyes tracked the rim of the bowl, not the shouting mouths. The men screaming, hands up, weren't the ones who mattered. The ones who mattered were the quiet shapes beside rocks. The shooter with a stable position and a spotter crouched low. The mortar lead adjusting by feel. The man with a rectangular pack and a wire running down into it. That wire was wrong. It didn't belong in a simple ambush. It was too deliberate, too technical. It ran to a small, boxy device tucked in snow shadow on a spur of rock that had line of sight over the whole basin. A jammer. That explained the dead radio. That explained the satellite link that wouldn't bite. That explained the confidence. They hadn't just set a kill zone. They'd cut the unit off from the world and then built a stage. She held the image in her head the way she held her breath, steady, controlled. Below, the team lead began to rise. Seconds before, it wasn't a metaphor. It was the distance between his knees, leaving the snow, and the first enemy finger tightening on a trigger. Her finger took the slack out of hers. The suppressed crack was small, almost gentle, swallowed by wind. It was nothing compared to the roar that had been battering the bowl for minutes. But it was the loudest thing in the world because it changed what everyone believed was possible. On the rim, a man standing too tall, confident, exposed, jerked as if someone had yanked him backward. There was no spray, no dramatic spin. He simply collapsed into the snow, limbs folding in a way that didn't look human. A beat of silence followed. Not because weapons stopped firing, but because minds did. In the bowl, the SEALs froze, half risen, half surrendered, suddenly unsure whether to stand or drop. The team lead's eyes snapped up, scanning. The comm specialist forgot to breathe. The wounded man blinked, pain briefly replaced by confusion. Above, the enemy's voices changed. The loudspeakers stuttered, the confidence cracking. What? A shout, sharp and panicked, cut through the air. Sniper. Another voice, furious now, yelling in a language the SEALs didn't speak, but anger translated. Then the English came again, raw and loud. Find a shooter. Find her. Find. The woman cycled her bolt. The sound was quiet as a thought. She didn't smile. She didn't celebrate. She just moved to the next problem. Hours earlier, the day had started the way these days always started. In a dim room that smelled like cold metal and instant coffee, with maps spread flat and faces lit by red-filtered light. Outside, the mountains were silhouettes against a dawn that hadn't yet decided to arrive. The mission was simple in a way that only dangerous things are simple. A ridgeline relay, half sensor, half data handoff point, had been identified as a conduit. Someone was moving stolen intelligence off-grid through this site, bouncing it through rugged terrain where satellites were blind and towns were distant. The plan was to hit it fast, grab what mattered, wipe what couldn't be carried, and disappear before anyone understood what had happened. A snatch and sweep. The SEAL element was lean by design. Team lead, comms, medic, 2 assaulters, a support controller who could talk to air if air could hear them, and then her, attached as precision overwatch. Quiet, newly rotated into their orbit. Competent in a way that didn't announce itself. Someone in the room had made a joke. Light, careless, meant to break tension. Overwatch insurance. Extra weight. A couple of men had smirked. Not cruel, not malicious. Just habitual. The reflex of underestimating what didn't match the silhouette they were used to. She hadn't reacted. She'd been looking at the topo, at the contour lines that told the truth. A bowl-shaped approach route. Goat paths that braided up the slopes. A saddle that offered the best planned overwatch on the ridge. She traced an alternate route with her finger and then erased it with her glove, because the lead had already chosen the clean line in and out. Weather had been a footnote in the brief. Wind picking up by noon, haze likely, snow drift patterns shifting visibility. Not a storm, just enough to turn long shots into questions. The comms plan had been thorough. Primary, backup, satellite fallback, short burst check-ins, a timetable that assumed the sky and the terrain would behave. She'd looked at the map and seen the flaw. There were spurs of high ground that had line of sight on the approach route, on the saddle, on the basin beyond. Perfect jamming points, perfect observation points, perfect places for a patient enemy to sit and wait. During infill, the mountains had been beautiful in that indifferent way. Snow and daylight bright enough to hurt. Cold, clean air that made every sound carry. Boots crunching, breath hissing, straps creaking. And then the signs. A fresh scrape mark on a rock where someone had dragged something heavy. A faint shimmer of wire half buried in snow crust. A strange absence of local movement. No herders, no kids, no smoke from small fires in places where life usually left traces. The trail had been too clean. No trash. No footprint crossing. Like someone had swept the mountain. She brought it up, quietly, not dramatic. A suggestion. We should shift Overwatch. Different perch gives us a better look at the rim. The team lead had glanced at his watch, at the schedule, and shook his head. We stay on plan. Protocol. Speed. The belief that movement was safety. She nodded. Not because she agreed. Because arguing didn't change anything. Instead, she built a contingency without saying the word. She memorized an alternate route. A narrow chimney in the rock she'd seen on the topo. A goat path that dropped into shadowed cuts. She mapped a secondary hide in her mind. She built a target ladder she hoped she'd never need. As they neared the ridge, a metallic chirp had floated across the wind. Quick, artificial. A drone? A spotter device? Something that didn't belong to the mountain. It had appeared as a black speck for a breath, and then vanished behind rock. The comm specialist had cocked his head, listening. Hear that? He'd asked. A faint rhythmic pulse had threaded through his headset for a moment, like a heartbeat made of static. Then it cleared. He'd shrugged it off as terrain. She hadn't. Near the mouth of the basin, she'd paused and looked down into it. Snow lay smooth in patches, broken by rock and scrub. In daylight, it looked harmless, just a dip in a mountainside. But the geometry felt wrong. Too perfect. A place that could be controlled. It was like walking into a room where everyone had stopped talking. And the first shots came. Not random. Not panicked. Shaped. A burst from behind pinned their rear. An RPG cracked near the front, throwing up snow and rock and a slap of concussion that made teeth rattle. Another burst stitched the path ahead, forcing them down and away from the ridge, into the bowl like water forced into a drain. The radio died in the same instant, the jammer coming fully alive. Primary went to hiss. Satellite link refused to connect, as if the sky itself had turned away. The enemy used the terrain like they'd built it. Shooters on 2 ridges crossed fire. A crew-serve gun controlled the only climb-out chute. A mortar team began walking rounds in, methodical, adjusting by feel as their impacts kicked up clouds of powder that made visibility collapse into a bright white fog. In the bowl, time became a stack of constraints. The medic moved to a casualty and caught shrapnel, a jagged piece that tore into his side. It wasn't mortal, but it was enough to slow him, enough to make every motion cost more. Ammo began to matter. Controlled pairs turned into single shots. One rifle started to overheat, the barrel steaming in cold air. Another had a feeding issue as grit and ice worked their way into the action. They tried smoke. The wind tore it sideways and laid it over them like a marker, turning concealment into a sign that said, "Here." Above, the enemy's voices weren't frantic. They were coordinated. Someone was calling adjustments like a drill instructor, moving fire where it needed to be, bracketing the climb out line the moment the team lead tested it. Pinned, cut off, bleeding, cold. And then the psychological pressure arrived, because competent enemies didn't waste an opportunity to break you. Hands up, came the loudspeaker again. You live. They promised propaganda. They promised cameras. They promised a capture that would be worth more than bodies. The team lead counted bodies, magazines, minutes. The extraction window was shrinking, and even if it wasn't, a bird wouldn't linger under mortar and heavy gun. He lifted the stand-down hand, because sometimes leadership was choosing the least terrible option. That was when she acted. From her separated position above, she'd watched the trap spring and realized the team couldn't hear her. She tried to transmit anyway, thumb tight on the push-to-talk, as if determination could punch through a jammer. Nothing. So she committed without permission, because surrender wasn't the end of violence. It was just the moment violence became one-sided. She slid back from the edge of her initial perch and began to move. Not running. Not dramatic. A crawl and climb. Shale under snow crust that wanted to give way. Thorn scrub hidden in drifts, grabbing fabric and skin. A narrow goat path that dropped into shadowed cuts where daylight turned blue and cold turned sharper. She checked her magazines. Not many. Overwatch loads were never many. She was supposed to fire sparingly, to cover and observe, not to fight a battle alone. That meant every round had to be a decision. A new threat returned in the distance. The drone, black against white, sweeping the ridge line slowly, searching for glint, for movement, for the shape of a human mistake. She dusted her hands and cheek with snow and grit, broke up her outline with a torn strip of fabric, timed her movement with gusts that blew powder across the rocks like a curtain. Protocol said stay with the unit. Protocol said don't separate. But protocol also assumed your comms worked and your plan held. This plan was dead. Below, a small herder's shack sat tucked into the slope, half buried in drift. A civilian silhouette flickered in a doorway. Just a shape, just a life. A moral constraint that mattered because it was easy to win a fight by burning everything around you. It was harder to win it without dragging innocence into your math. She heard enemy climbers before she saw them. The faint scrape of metal on rock. The muffled crunch of boots on crust. Two-man teams, moving with ropes, trying to get above any possible shoot or hide. They were good. That meant she had to be better. She chose the risky flank. A narrow chimney between rocks, steep and tight, and brutal on elbows, the kind of climb that cost time and skin. But it gave her something the enemy hadn't planned for, an angle that didn't exist on their mental map. At the top, she slid into a secondary hide behind a slab of stone that broke her silhouette and offered partial cover. From here, she could see the rim of the bowl in pieces. 3 key nodes. A mortar team clustered around their tube, adjusting. A man near a boxy device with a wire running down into it, the jammer. And a leader with binoculars, standing slightly behind the others. Posture relaxed, confidence in control. Her optic crack distorted the edge of the basin, but she had an undamaged portion of glass. She adjusted her eye relief. She used holds she knew by feel. Wind, distance, angle. She didn't recite numbers to herself. She felt the mountain's breath, watched the snow drift, let experience settle into her hands. Below, the surrender motion had begun. Hands rising, heads lifting. Seconds before, her finger tightened and the suppressed crack went out into daylight. The first man to drop wasn't the loudest. He wasn't the closest. He was the one who mattered because he stood too tall, too confident, a probable spotter or coordinator. The enemy's rhythm faltered. In that falter, she saw the true center of the trap, the jammer. If she could cut it, she could give a unit agency again. Not rescue, not victory, just the ability to speak and move like a team instead of a set of isolated men. Her second shot was the turning point. She aimed not at the box itself, too small, too uncertain, but at the operator's body and the power line leading into the device. The round landed. The operator folded into snow. The boxy device sputtered, a tiny puff of smoke melting powder around it. Down in the bowl, the comms specialist blinked as the hiss in his headset thinned. For a heartbeat, there was nothing. Then a broken voice, distant, clipped, cracked through. Move left 2 at time. He jerked his head up, eyes wide. We've got. He started, then caught himself. No time for celebration. Just action. The team lead her enough to understand. Someone was talking. Someone was alive on the net. The world hadn't abandoned them. He snapped into motion, simple commands, hand signals reinforced by the smallest bits of sound that got through. Smoke. Move left. 2 at a time. They didn't stand. They didn't surrender. They shifted like water finding a crack. Above, she transitioned to the mortar lead. The mortar team had been walking rounds in like a metronome. If she broke their rhythm, the bowl would stop shrinking. Her next shot cut the man who was adjusting. He collapsed into the tube, hands slack. The next round never left the mortar because there was no one to fire it. The enemy responded fast because they were competent. They didn't panic for long. They adapted. A shout went up. The drone angled toward her ridge line, tightening its sweep. Climbers moved with urgency now, no longer searching abstractly, but hunting a real threat. She didn't get greedy. She fired, then shifted. A foot, 2 feet, a crawl into a different shadow. A change in angle that made return fire chew the wrong rock. She saw an RPG gunner raise the tube, trying to catch the SEALs in their movement. She took a mid-shoulder lift, the tube slipping from his hands. The assistant reached for it. She tagged him 2, sequential, methodical. 2 rounds, 2 problems removed. In the bowl, the SEALs exploited the gaps. They dragged the wounded, moved in short sprints, hugged the low folds of terrain, climbed toward a less covered exit line that had been impossible minutes ago. Enemy fire grew uncoordinated for a moment, because leadership had been cut, because the jammer was dead, because the mortar rhythm was broken. Bursts hit rock instead of lanes. Shots snapped wide. Confusion, not collapse, yet. Then the crew-served gun reoriented. Heavy rounds began chewing her cover, walking up the slab of rock as if a giant hand was tearing it apart. Stone chips stung her cheek. Snow sprayed. The mountain's calm face suddenly turned violent right where she lay. She had to risk a shot under pressure. She found the gunner, tucked behind a bipod, face low. She took him. The assistant shifted to swing the weapon toward her suspected position. She took him too. Silence fell on that flank like a door closing. The drone banked, close enough now that she could hear its faint whine under the wind. Her cracked optic bloomed glare as sunlight hit it at the wrong angle. Just a flash of betrayal. She froze, not because she was calm, but because she forced function over fear. Breath held, body pressed into stone. She let the drone pass overhead, its camera searching, searching, searching. It didn't find her because she didn't give it movement. She didn't give it shine. She didn't give breath. When it banked away, she moved again, sliding into a new crease in the rock. Below, the enemy tried their last adaptation. A flanking element dropped into the bowl, moving fast, trying to close distance and force a capture. Not just a kill, capture. For cameras. For a message. She switched priorities instantly. Close threat first. 2 rapid shots. 1 flanker dropped. The second stumbled, shocked by the sudden violence from nowhere. The rest hesitated, because hesitation was what happened when your confidence got punctured. That hesitation was all the SEALs needed. In the distance, the low thump of rotors began to ghost through the air, faint, far, but real. Supporting fires cracked on a separate ridge, not near enough to be decisive, but near enough to tell the enemy, They were losing control of the timeline. The extraction window wasn't open wide. It was barely a slit, but it existed. The SEAL lead pushed the unit toward the pickup zone under partial cover, hauling wounded, moving with a brutal economy of men who knew the next minute mattered more than the last 10. Up on the ridge, she saw the rectangular case again, an enemy operator hauling it down the slope with too much care, too much protection. That case was the enemy's real purpose. Not just bodies, not just propaganda. The case was an objective. If she could stop it, she could stop the story the enemy wanted to tell. She tracked the carrier through drifting powder, through glare, through the distortion in her cracked glass. The carrier moved like he understood value, shielded by others who threw themselves into fire lanes to keep him alive. She waited. Not long, just long enough for the carrier to step into a gap that made the shot clean. Her final cohesion breaker hit wasn't a flourish. It was a decision. The carrier dropped. The case tumbled and landed in snow, half buried. The men around him faltered, suddenly unsure whether to keep fighting or recover the objective. That uncertainty rippled out like a crack through ice. In the bowl, the SEAL lead heard the change in fire. Not silence, but a loosening. He keyed his mic, voice rough. "Whoever you are, keep them off us." She didn't answer. Not because she didn't want to, because staying to talk meant dying. She was already moving. By the time the bird's shadow swept across the snow and the team clambered into the wash of rotor wind, she was sliding down the far side of a ridge, making herself small, disappearing into folds of terrain the drone couldn't see. The enemy fired at the helicopter, angry, frustrated, but their fire was late and scattered. The bird lifted, dragging the unit out of the bowl like a hand pulling men from ice water. When the world finally steadied, the mountains fell away beneath them, bright and indifferent. The SEALs sat strapped in, chests heaving, eyes wide, faces smeared with powder and blood and snow melt. The wounded man still lived. Barely. The medic's hands were red and shaking, but his jaw was set. Function over fear. Always. The comms specialist stared at his dead beacon, then at the radio that had saved them by being silent again, and then out at the ridgeline where a woman had been. He didn't know her name in that moment. He didn't know why she'd been alone. He only knew someone had fired a shot that changed math. Back at the forward outpost, the debrief room was a harsh rectangle of fluorescent light that made everyone look older. Bandages showed through collars. Eyes had that hollow brightness that came from surviving something that had been one decision away from becoming a headline. A screen displayed waveforms and logs. The comms analysis showed the faint rhythmic interference from earlier. The pulse was a jammer warming up. It wasn't terrain. It was intent. The intel officers laid out what the enemy had wanted. The relay site had been moving stolen data, a packet of identities and locations, the kind of information that got people killed quietly. The rectangular case had been a storage/transfer module, hardened, designed to be carried off the ridge and vanished into the mountains. The ambush wasn't random violence. It was a staged operation meant to do two things at once: seize or erase the intel and capture Americans on camera for propaganda. A competent enemy with a plan. The team lead listened without interruption, his face still as stone. When the briefing ended, he looked at his men and then looked toward the doorway. She stood there, quiet, optic cracked, tape still holding where glass had betrayed her. Snowmelt dripped from the edge of her gear. She looked like she'd walked out of the mountain rather than through a door. Someone behind the team lead cleared his throat, awkward, trying to find language that matched what had happened. There were no jokes now, no insurance, no extra weight. The team lead spoke instead, voice flat, simple. "You saved my guys." It wasn't praise. It was fact. She nodded once, as if acknowledging a report. An officer asked about her movement, why she'd been separated, why she'd acted without comms confirmation. She didn't get defensive. She didn't perform. She answered in the same tone she'd fired with, clean and controlled. The surrender wasn't going to be a surrender. "Why are you so sure?" the officer pressed, hungry for certainty. For the first time, something flickered behind her eyes. An old image, a memory she didn't like to carry. "I've seen what happens when you wait," she said. Not dramatic, just honest. Sometimes the trap doesn't close slowly. Sometimes it closes all at once. No one asked for details. The room didn't need them. The scar in her voice was enough. They spoke about the herder's shack, too, confirmed by aerial imagery and later ground reports. A civilian had been there. Her shot discipline, her refusal to draw return fire into that doorway, had kept the fight from spilling into a life that never signed up for it. The team lead turned slightly so the higher-ups could hear. She made shots with a cracked optic. She took the jammer first. Mortar lead second. She kept us alive long enough to move. That's what happened. A quiet acknowledgement, public and final. She didn't stand taller. She didn't take the spotlight. She simply adjusted the tape on her optic like it was the only thing that needed attention. When the debrief ended, the room emptied in small clusters. Men moved stiffly, favoring bruises and bandages. The team lead lingered, watching her for a moment as if he was recalibrating something inside himself. Outside, daylight still ruled. Snow glare still hurt. The mountains were still indifferent. She stepped out into the cold and walked a few paces away from the building, alone for a moment, the kind of alone that had been her default for longer than anyone in that unit had understood. Then boots crunched behind her. 1, 2, 3. The seals fell in step, not formal, not ceremonial. Just a quiet decision to be near the person who had been near them when it counted. No one said the words you might expect. No one made it sentimental. Respect in their world didn't need poetry. It needed truth. And the truth was simple. The loudest victories weren't always the ones that saved you. Sometimes it was the silent shot you never saw coming.